Hello and welcome to the third presentation in the Treesearch and WWSC Center virtual conference series. This series was initiated to contribute to the scientific discussion in a time where conferences are being cancelled due to the COVID-19 outbreak. The full program is found at the Treesearch webpage. My name is Josefin Illegård, and today I have the pleasure to present Lennart Bergström from Stockholm University, who will present tailoring wet strength and heat transfer of nanocellulose-based films and foams. Professor Bergström's research activities span the academic disciplines of materials engineering and applied surface and colloid science. You in the audience can interact and ask questions or comment via YouTube's chat function. For that, you need to have a YouTube account with a YouTube channel. This time, we will also try the opportunity to text questions, and the telephone number will be shown in the chat window in a moment. Any questions to Lennart Bergström will be answered after the presentation that will last approximately 30 minutes. With that, I hand over to Lennart.
Thank you very much. I will then first start to handle my share screen here. Yes, it works, right? Okay, so it's a first for everyone, and for me this is the first time I'm giving a public lecture over Zoom, so I will do my best. So yes, I'm going to talk today about tailoring wet strength and heat transfer of nanocellulose-based films and foams. This represents, you can say, the ongoing work in my group, and I will try to be as current as possible. But at this time, I will mainly be restricting myself to recently published work. But before going on, I mean, all of you are aware of the situation we're in with the coronavirus, and we as scientists, I think many of us are asking ourselves, what can we contribute with? And that was something also we did about 2 weeks ago. And in particular, when it became aware in Stockholm that there is a huge crisis and lack of equipment. And as chemists, we also took up the challenge to try to alleviate the lack of hand sanitizer in Stockholm. And that's a project which has been ongoing now for a little more than 2 weeks. Stockholm University, together with many partners, have up to now produced 6,900 liters of hand sanitizers. And I should also point out that here we have students also from the Wallenberg Wood Science Center being involved, in particular then Esan Hadi here, who is a recently employed PhD student within my group. Producing hand sanitizer is not difficult, but of course you have to follow certain protocols and so on. And that's something which we have learned along the way. But the situation was simply that it was a complete crisis where both the hospitals, the ambulance service, and not the least the elderly homes were running out. And the situation today is that we are actually continuing. We decided to continue another 2 weeks because the elderly homes, in particular in region Stockholm, you still have a huge lack of hand sanitizer. And I want to thank everyone here, not only the people involved, but also the sponsors here, which we have had a lot of sponsors, both from industry and from other institutions like Naturhistoriska Riksmuseet. All right, with having said that, I would like to continue back to the science. So I'm going to talk about certain aspects about nanocellulose-based materials. I think many of you are very aware of nanocellulose materials, and it's been a tremendous surge of publications within this field. And that means that one has to clearly identify where there is a lack of knowledge or where there is an opportunity for significant improvement. And I try to do this in this slide. So the advantage is something which we are all well aware of, that nanocellulose is a flexible and mechanically strong nanomaterial. It has a low density and it's relatively easy to functionalize, which means we have a lot of opportunities. But the challenges in general is One of them, of course, relates to that it's difficult to process at high concentrations. That's a major stopper for a lot of industrial applications. So we need to be able to understand what's going on at high concentrations and preferably also solve problems related to highly concentrated dispersions. That's something I'm working on, but I will not present today. The other issue, as with all biomaterials, is of course mitigation of species and season variability. So a biomaterial or a nanomaterial originating from nature is not a constant. So it will vary depending on the species and season. And we need to handle that. We need to both be able to characterize the material carefully and also to provide robust processes which can handle that. Again, something I'm interested in, but I will not talk about that today. But I will mainly focus on the lower two topics. So the low wet strength is something which is very well known and has been an issue with all cellulose-based materials for decades, not to say centuries. And here, for many applications, we need to find viable solutions to improve the wet strength. And the other topic, which is very general, is the optimization of functional properties. So nanocellulose, the more we study it, we understand that it has some very interesting functional properties. But that means we both have to improve our fundamental understanding and to design engineering solutions to optimize these properties. And I will focus today on the thermal conductivity or heat transfer properties, which is something I've been very interested in and trying to understand in detail over the last 4 or 5 years. So the content of the talk will be, I will present our recent work on the leather-inspired engineering of multifunctional biohybrids with high wet strength, then go over to a patterning. I will present that relatively briefly. A Bogolan-inspired patterning in nanocellulose films, and then focus on the heat transfer of nanocellulose-based materials with going through the fundamentals, talk about films, and then isotropic foams and aerogels, and then on anisotropic foams, giving examples and trying to relate this to the fundamental modes of heat transport. Starting then with the improvement of the wet strength by a leather-inspired approach. This is work done by my PhD student, Konstantin Kriechbaum. It was recently published in Biomacromolecules. And the idea here is relatively simple. We have been inspired then by how leather is being made. And the basic process in leather making is a precipitation of the proteins by tannins. Today, there are other types of compounds being used, but the traditional way of leather making was to use tannins. So it's a precipitation of proteins. And these precipitates then are have a very low water solubility. They are quite robust and also flexible, which means that's why leather have quite nice properties. And our idea was simply, can we also instill these kinds of properties into a nanocellulose-based composite? So what we started here was the grafting of gelatin onto cellulose nanofibrils. They were dispersed in water. We prepared thin films, which means it's then a gelatin at a CNF material. These films were very transparent, so it's put on top of this back material here. Then we immersed this material into a tannin solution, for example, tannic acid. The tannic acid then reacts with the gelatin, precipitates the gelatin, and then we get this brownish, this film with a slight brownish color. And that is then the tannin gelatin CNF composites. And I'm going to go through the properties of this material here in some detail. First of all, let's look at the water uptake and swelling. So regular CNF film, or the ones we are using, have a very large water uptake. So it has a water uptake 160% of its own weight. If we if we just mix CNF, gelatin, and tannic acid, we reduce the water uptake to 90%, but this is not a major increase. If we graft gelatin onto CNF, we reduce the water uptake even more. And if we precipitate then this material with tannic acid, gelatin, the tannic acid precipitated gelatin grafted onto CNF, you can see that then the water uptake is down to a little more than 20%. So it's a significant decrease of the water uptake. And that's also reflected on the difference here of the swollen films. So the water swollen CNF films, you can see has a very high porosity. So this is crash frozen and then with the SEM, while the cross section of the leather inspired films have basically preserved to a much higher extent its laminated structure and swells much less. The mechanical properties of these materials then. So here on the left, we have the dry tensile strength. So I think most of you know is that the pure CNF films have pretty good dry mechanical properties with a tensile stress, in this case above 100 megapascals, and a strain at failure which is around 16%. The material, the leather inspired material we prepared has a little higher strength, but a little lower strain to failure. So it's not a major improvement. No, the major improvement is of course on the wet state. And what we are talking about here is that the material has been immersed for 1 hour in deionized water, and then it's kept saturated during the tensile testing. So the CNF is of course pretty useless. It's has a very low wet tensile strength, and it fails after about 7% of elongation. The material improves with the surface modification and the grafting, but the real improvement comes then with the precipitation of the gelatin, where we then can reach a wet tensile strength of about 35 megapascals and a strain of failure of about 20%, which is quite a promising property. As you can see, this is also used only then. We use the gelatin, of course, from in this case from animals, and the tannic acid from the bark. It's possible also to recycle these materials, and that's based upon well-known properties of tannic acid, gelatin, protein precipitates. So what we can see here is that if you then put in this material into seawater, it resists that very well. So a very high ionic strength is not a problem for this material. For a lot of the ionically bound materials, for example, with multivalent metal ions, increasing the ionic strength will probably have quite a significant reduction then in the wet strength. But we can then disintegrate this material by adding then a surfactant, sodium dodecyl sulfonate, together with a solvent, and then we will disintegrate the gelatin tannic acid complex, and coming back basically to the similar strength and modulus as the mixtures of CNF, gelatin, and tannic acid. So this is, of course, also quite promising, suggesting that these materials could be recycled. The addition of tannins, like tannic acid, also has another infer the material with another properties, and that is the antioxidant properties, which you can see here. So the addition of tannic acid then means that it can inhibit free radicals very strongly, also over an extended period of time, not only after 5 minutes, but also after 5 hours. And that's, of course, can be of interest for some types of packaging materials, for example, for food packaging. Let me move over then and briefly talk about another type of materials based on tannins, and that's the iron gall links and the iron tannin patterning. So what you're utilizing here is a very well known, since actually the medieval times, the reaction between tannins and iron form then a black compound. So this is then an example of the iron gall links, which were used from the 1500s in Europe until the advent of the synthetic inks, 1850, something like that. So this was the major type of ink being used in all documents. But it's also important for a lot of dyeing of textiles, in particular of cotton-based textiles. And this is an example from the so-called Bogolan type of dyeing, which is very important in the country of Mali. We took inspiration from this and then tried to devise a patterning method based on iron and tannins. And this is an example of when we are mixing the tannins, like gallic acid, ellagic acid, and tannic acid with an iron source and cellulose nanofibrils. And as you can see, we can then form black, completely black films then, showing that there is a strong interaction between these coordination complexes and the cellulose nanofibrils. And that's also visible here with the AFM, where you go from the pure film, and then you have the film coated with only the tannins, like the gallic acid. You form small clusters, and then you react it with the iron, and the clusters or the nanoparticles then reside onto the surface of the fibrils. This was supported by a modeling being done by Jakob Wåhlert within the Wallenberg Wood Science Center, trying to understand how does, in this case, gallic acid and ellagic acid interact with the nanocellulose, and how does it cluster. And the modeling clearly showed that the interaction is immediate, but the mobility of the gallic acid and ellagic acid on the surface of nanocellulose is quite rapid. And that's why after a short time, they will form these kinds of clusters. And it's these clusters then which later react with the iron, forming the coordination complexes. We have utilized this in a simplified patterning process, where we then pattern nanocellulose films using then this kind of soft lithography approach, using both stripe patterns and these kinds of dots. And then we have then first impregnated the films with tannins, and then we print it with the metal salt solution. And as you can see here, we can form then, we can definitely react the iron with the tannins, but because also of de-wetting issues, that mainly occurs then at the interface here, or the edge of the pattern materials. What's interesting is that you can also take this one step further and go away from iron, also use cobalt and copper. So tannins are well known to form coordination complexes with a range of multivalent metal ions, forming different colors. And in the case of iron, that means that the color is also pH sensitive. So at low pH, it's dominated by a monocomplex, and at the tris complex, then it's dominating at the high pH. And as you can see, these have different colors. So suggesting that these kinds of simple patterning approach can also be used for sensor applications. Okay, let's move on then to the final part, which is going to be on heat transfer. Heat transfer is fundamentally a process which involves several length scales and also several processes. And that's why it's important also to understand the structure of the materials. So here, I'm just schematically showing going from the single crystal, so from the cellulose molecules to the packing within a crystal, and then give an example also of wood tissue, because wood itself is anisotropic. So with the anisotropic heat transfer properties of nanocellulose. That is also then spilled over to anisotropic heat transfer properties of wood. So typically wood has a factor of 2 or more difference in heat transfer, transversal or axial to the lumen direction. And some people have utilized it also to study then the effect of alignment in thin films. And I'm going to give an example of that. So that's in particular work by Dr. Uetani in Japan, who have studied them by drawing films with various forms of cellulose nanocrystals, and then studied the effect of the thermal conductivity as a function of the order parameter, and then studied then with all 3 directions. So the thermal conductivity in the draw direction, in the transversal direction, and then in the normal direction. And as you can see, the normal direction here does not really vary as the degree of order increases. But when it comes then to the draw direction and the transversal direction, this changes quite a lot. There is also an effect of the dimensions of the cellulose nanocrystal. So the cross-sectional area here basically refer then to the diameter of the cellulose nanocrystals, where the largest cross-sectional area relates then to tunicate cellulose nanocrystals. And this, the final figure here shows then the effect of, in this case, the diffusivity, how that changes then as a function of diameter, showing that we can get a very high degree of anisotropy in films of the heat transfer, up to a factor of 8, which is basically the theoretically limit for a single fibril. So modeling work has suggested that there is basically the heat transport in the axial direction is 8 times larger than the heat transfer in the transversal direction. And that's something you start to approach here. Moving over to foams then, where my own research has focused. I think all of you are aware of that there is now a lot of interest in making nanocellulose-based foams. They are lightweight, pretty strong. But one of the big challenges is, of course, how to make them. And here, the removal of the solvent, which is normally water, and the engineering of moisture uptake and release is crucial points. And here's just an outline of the main techniques to produce them. So either supercritical drying, freeze drying, or evaporative drying can be in an oven or just at room temperature. Of course, evaporative drying has the advantage of scaling and being pretty cheap, but the problem here is that you have the capillary forces during drying, which can collapse the structure. And that's why quite often the supercritical drying and the freeze drying is being preferred. Here are a couple of examples of isotropic nanocellulose-based foams produced by evaporative drying. This is a early work done together with Lars Wåhlberg and his group, where a Pickering foam was being made by using then a short chain surfactant, octanol, or octanoic acid, which then provide the particles with some hydrophobic character. And in this case was done in my work, where we were also using calcium as a way to precipitate or to strengthen the network to resist the stresses during evaporative drying. But the key point here is that the pore structure is isotropic, and there is no preferred alignment of the fibrils. If you have such a case, you can analyze then the modes of heat transport based upon classical theories. And there are basically the 4 major contributions to heat transfer. I don't have time to go through in detail, but convection is one, of course, the transport of gas in a temperature gradient. And basically you minimize convection if you have the pore size is small enough. Radiation is a process which becomes important at elevated temperatures, but at room temperature, it's relatively insignificant. So for biomaterials which cannot really stand high temperatures, this is also not a major contribution. And that's why we normally focus then on the gas conduction and the solid conduction. And when it comes to the gas conduction, the main issue here is the mean free path of air. So if you can start to reduce the pore size below the mean free path of air, you can have the so-called Knudsen effects, and that means that you will have a reduction of the gas conduction contribution. And the solid conduction is all about phonon transport, lattice vibrations. And if you can then scatter these phonons, that means that you can also reduce solid conduction. So interfaces here played a major role. Scattering at interfaces, and that can be an interfaces within the material, grain boundaries, but it can also be interfaces between different components, in particular if they are nano-sized. And that's something we are trying to understand in detail, both of these effects. And I will try to give you a short overview of some of the work in the literature and then some of our own work. When it comes to the isotropic foams, the work in University of Tokyo by Isoga and Saito and co-workers showed in a very nice study where they used cellulose nanofibrils, supercritically dried, and they compared supercritically dried and freeze-dried. So and this suggests some interesting phenomena. So when it comes to the supercritically dried, they have a clear isotropic and relatively homogeneous pore structure. And there you find the classic, what you would expect, that as the density of the foam increases, the thermal conductivity increases. The more solid material you put in, then the thermal conductivity increases. On the other hand, the freeze-dried foams, they have an unexpected behavior where you have a reduction in thermal conductivity initially as the density increases. And if you compare the specific surface areas here, you see it's a major difference. The supercritically dried aerogels have much higher surface areas. So just from simple estimates, you would expect these materials to have a lower thermal conductivity than the foams, but that's not the case. And that suggests, if we go back, that even though you reduce the gas conduction for the supercritically dried foams, aerogels, it is the reduction of the solid conduction in the freeze-dried foams which plays a bigger part and can explain then this behavior. But that calls for a much more detailed analysis of the interfaces, which is, I would say, a very important challenge for the future to try to understand. This gives some further support for that. So if you then start to mix the CNF with another material, you will create heterogeneous interfaces. So here you have CNF being mixed with a zeolite. Actually, this is cellulose, not CNF, mixed then with CNF. So you have a nanomaterial and a macromaterial. And here you have CNF mixed with metal organic frameworks. And you see in all these cases, even you put in a relatively minor amount of the additional material, you have a reduction in the thermal conductivity, which is probably you can relate then to the formation of heterogeneous interfaces and the phonon scattering occurring of those interfaces. Freeze drying and freeze casting has the possibility to align the fibrils, and that means you have a possibility to utilize the anisotropic properties of the fibrils, because they have as I said before, a factor of 8 difference in thermal conductivity in the axial and the radial direction. And that's something which clearly is manifested here. You can see the difference in the radial and the axial heat transport, where the red is the radial, and then depending then on so the specific energy consumption actually relates then to diameter. The higher energy consumption, the smaller the diameter, and then the radial thermal conductivity is being reduced down to the below the value of 25, which is the typical value then for air. So these are super insulating materials. And this was actually the early inspiration of that, where we then were mixing CNF with graphene oxide and CPO-like for fire resistance. And we could really achieve then these kinds of low thermal conductivities. And now it's, after some more years, we start to understand the importance, in particular, of the interfaces and the phonon scattering. And that's something which we want to continue to work on. Yes, and this is just to highlight then the highly anisotropic structure of these, with the pores, the macropores also aligned, which is then a consequence of the ice growth, and then the alignment of the fibrils at the same time. So to conclude here, when it comes to the heat transfer and the thermal conductivity, when we talk about the fundamentals, I would say it is this, the understanding of the pore structure and how to control it, the heterogeneous interfaces, and the nanoparticle alignment is the key. And it's quite interesting to see that there is basically a complete lack of such studies in the literature, where all of these parameters have been carefully controlled and characterized. And that suggests that we have still a lot of possibilities then for the optimization of the material's properties, and of course to combine it also with the high strength, high moisture resistance, and a fire resistance. So with that, I want to conclude. I want to acknowledge my co-workers, both within my own group and collaborators around the world, and not the least within the Wallenberg Wood Science Center. Also want to thank the funding agencies, and thank you for your attention. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Lennart. I will remind that there is still possibilities to send in questions either through the live chat, or if you want to text your questions to, you can use this number that I hope is shown on the screen right now. We have one comment, I should say, so far on the live chat. It's Tobias Abrahamsson who writes, "Thank you for streaming this lecture." So thank you very much, Lennart, for making your premiere here through this series.
Yeah.
I have a question.
Sure, go ahead.
You were talking about fire resistance, which of course is an important thing when it comes to insulation. How about microbial growth, which is also important for insulation materials?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, so in the previous work we used boric acid for that, because it's a well-known additive to stop in particularly fungi. So that's used today actually in cellulose-based insulation materials. So here you have I think a couple of accepted solutions, and boric acid is one of them.
We have more questions coming in. We have Diana, who is asking, what is the metal salt used for pattern transfer using PDMS?
Yeah, it's okay. So we use a simple iron. Actually, we use both iron 3 and iron 2 salts. Can be nitrates. What you also need to do, and that's actually in the publication, is sometimes you need to change the viscosity a bit in order to improve the transfer. You can, for example, add a polymer to increase the viscosity. But the salts are simple iron 3 or iron 2 salts, and typically nitrates then, and the same goes for the cobalt and the copper.
So then we have a question from Daniel Söderberg, who writes, "Thank you, Lennart, for the presentation. Maybe this is a stupid question, but what's your view of the possibility to scale up the super insulator?"
So that depends on the method for production. So we have a number of methods for production, but since I was primarily talking about the fundamentals, trying to understand the fundamentals more, we of course focus then on production methods where we can control the structure, the porosity, the alignment very well. And maybe that's not the techniques for scaling up.
So we're still waiting if there is someone else who wants to take this opportunity to ask something. I take the opportunity to say what comes next in this seminar series, where we give the audience a chance to write in some more. Today we have just had Lennart Bergström then present his seminar, and already now on Thursday we have Stefan Roth from KTH and DESY who will present. The title and abstract is found on the Treesearch webpage. And we continue with one more seminar before Easter, that is on Tuesday, where Gunnar Westman from Chalmers will present, but we will also be back after Easter with even more seminars. So I say thank you very much for this interesting presentation. And I don't see any more questions. So with that, I close the seminar. Or do you want to say something?
No, I just want to thank you for organizing this. Thank you very much.
And thank you all for listening.